The forest had always been a place of peace for me. I met Sophie on a hike up Mount Elbrus about 5 years ago. The way she navigated those steep trails, her laughter carrying through the crisp mountain air, had captivated me from the start. Back then, our shared love for adventure had felt like a spark that would never fade. But somewhere along the way, the flame between us dimmed, and these days, it felt more like we were simply two people walking parallel paths. Sophie had grown colder, and I found myself longing for the connection we once had. Determined to revive those old feelings, I decided to organize a camping trip, hoping that being in the mountains might rekindle our spark. I invited some close friends along, hoping their presence would ease any tension between Sophie and me. Among them was Mike, Sophie's ex. The thought of him tagging along gnawed at me, but he was now dating one of Sophie's best friends, Rachel. Keeping things cordial seemed wise, even if Mike's presence reminded me of the past. We found the perfect spot near the base of a mountain ridge, nestled between towering pine trees. As we set up camp, the scent of pine needles and the sound of rustling leaves took me back to that first climb with Sophie. It felt almost nostalgic, a reminder of what we once had. I glanced over at her as she unpacked her things, her focus fixed elsewhere, not once looking my way. The ache in my chest grew, and I couldn't help but wonder if coming here was a mistake. As evening approached, we gathered around the fire, the warmth providing a welcome contrast to the cool mountain air. The group was lively, laughing and reminiscing about past adventures. I did my best to join in, but each laugh felt forced, each smile an effort. My gaze kept drifting to Sophie, who sat a little too close to Mike for my comfort. I noticed the subtle glances they exchanged, the soft smiles, and the casual touch of her hand on his arm. Rachel seemed oblivious, her attention focused on the stories Mike told about their last trip together. Every now and then, she'd lean against him, eyes twinkling, clearly wrapped up in her own happiness. Watching them, I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, not for Rachel, but for what they had. I wanted that ease, that warmth with Sophie again. Yet, it felt like she was drifting further away, a ghost of the woman I once knew. As the fire died down and the stars began to dot the sky, I found myself sitting alone, lost in thought. I could hear Mike and Sophie's laughter drifting through the trees as they strolled just outside the fire's glow. I tried to focus on the beauty around me, the peace I once found in these settings, but my mind kept pulling me back to them. It felt as if the distance between Sophie and me had never been so vast, each shared glance between her and Mike a reminder of the connection that was slipping from my grasp. I leaned back, staring up at the stars, hoping the serenity of the night would calm my racing thoughts. After the fire had dwindled and our friends drifted to their tents, I decided it was time to turn in. Sophie and I had set up our tent a bit further from the group, seeking privacy or perhaps just a chance to reconnect without anyone watching. I was determined to make this night special, to remind her of the warmth we used to share. Inside the tent, I carefully laid out the sleeping bags, arranging them side by side on the air mattress I'd just finished inflating. I even brought along a few extra pillows, wanting to make the space as comfortable as possible. As a final touch, I made a couple of mugs of hot tea, hoping the warmth might bring us closer, if only for a moment. Once everything was set, I went to call Sophie. I expected her to be just outside the tent, enjoying the last bit of the fire's warmth or chatting with Rachel. But when I stepped out, I didn't see her by the fire or anywhere near our friends. Figuring she might have gone for a quick walk, I called her name, my voice low enough not to disturb anyone. No response. I called again, louder this time, but only the distant sounds of the forest replied. A pang of worry gripped me. Sophie wasn't one to wander off alone, not at night. After a few more minutes of fruitless searching and calling her name, I felt a flicker of something heavier than worry settling in. It was frustration, mixed with a familiar unease that had been growing since we arrived. My instincts nudged me towards the woods, my feet crunching softly on fallen leaves as I scanned the shadowed edges of the campsite, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself that she must be nearby, maybe gathering her thoughts alone, a habit she'd picked up lately when things felt strained between us. But as I ventured further into the darkness, every rustling leaf and snapping twig heightened my anxiety. Then, as I neared a cluster of trees just beyond the campsite, I saw movement, a flash of light and the soft, unmistakable murmur of voices. Heart pounding, I slowed my pace and strained to listen. The voices grew clearer, and I recognized one of them immediately. It was Mike. My gut clenched as I realized that the other voice, softer and barely above a whisper, was Sophie's. I took a deep breath, steadying myself against the surge of emotions that rose within me. Part of me wanted to turn back, to pretend I hadn't heard or seen anything. After all, I didn't know what they were talking about or why they were here alone. But a stronger, more desperate part of me couldn't walk away. I had to know. I held my breath, hidden in the shadows, my heartbeat thundering in my chest. Watching them from the edge of the trees, I felt like I was on the outside of my own life, peering into a scene that couldn't possibly be real. They walked a little further into the forest, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the night, a bitter reminder of the joy we used to share in moments like this. After stuffing everything into the car, I slammed the trunk shut, taking a deep breath to steady myself. But the anger and bitterness still churned within me, swirling with the disbelief and confusion of the betrayal I just witnessed. There was no way I could leave without letting Rachel know exactly what kind of man she was with, even if that meant stirring up more chaos. She deserved to know, to feel the same truth that had burned through me. I walked over to Rachel's tent, the words forming in my head, each one sharpened by anger. I wasn't sure how she'd react, but at this point, I didn't care. As I approached, I could see her sitting by the dying embers of the fire, gazing quietly into the flames, lost in thought. She looked peaceful, completely unaware of the storm about to hit her. I almost hesitated, a small voice in my head urging me to just leave it alone. But I pushed the thought aside. She needed to know. "Rachel," I called out, my voice sounding rough and hollow to my own ears. She turned to look at me, surprise flickering in her eyes as she noticed the packed car behind me. "What's going on, Jack?" she asked, her brows knitting together in confusion. "Are you leaving already?" I took a deep breath, my fists clenching as I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Rachel, I thought you should know, Mike is out there with Sophie right now," I said, forcing each word out. "They're together, in the woods, and I saw them. I saw them kissing, doing more than that." The shock that rippled across her face was immediate, her mouth opening slightly as her eyes widened. She stared at me, processing my words, and I braced myself for the hurt and anger I assumed would follow. Instead, after a moment, her expression softened, almost sympathetic. "Oh, Jack," she said quietly, shaking her head. "We haven't been together for a long time." It took a second for her words to register, and when they did, they hit me like a punch to the gut. The anger that had been simmering, waiting to be unleashed, suddenly found no target. Confusion replaced it, swirling with the remnants of betrayal and disbelief. I stood there, struggling to make sense of what she was saying. Had everything I thought about their relationship been a lie? "But, you're here together," I stammered, my voice tinged with frustration and bewilderment. I thought you two were still." Rachel let out a sad chuckle, her gaze dropping back to the fire. "No, Jack. We broke up months ago," she said softly. "We thought it was better to keep things quiet, for the sake of the group. No one likes to see breakups up close, you know." She looked up at me, a mixture of sympathy and resignation in her eyes. "I thought you knew. I assumed you picked up on it." I felt a rush of emotions, embarrassment, anger, and a strange, hollow relief. Here I was, ready to drop a bombshell, expecting to pull Rachel into my hurt and anger, only to realize she was already on the other side, separated from him in ways I hadn't known. All the pain I had carried back to camp, the vengeful sense of exposing them, suddenly felt misplaced, almost foolish. "Oh," I managed, feeling strangely deflated, as if my own anger had nowhere left to go. "I didn't know." Rachel offered a small, understanding smile, and it struck me then how different our pain was. While mine was fresh, sharp, and raw, hers was like a faded scar, something she had already come to terms with. Her acceptance of it only heightened the bitterness gnawing at me. "I get it, Jack," she said, reaching out to give my shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Sometimes people change. Sometimes the people you thought you knew, they turn into someone else. Mike and I, we grew apart, and I've accepted that. But I'm sorry you had to find out about Sophie this way." Her words were soft, her empathy genuine, and for a moment, I felt the weight of my own hurt pressing down on me. I couldn't explain it, how her acceptance of her own breakup made me feel both a sense of shame and a deepening resentment. I wanted to scream, to rage against what I had seen, but Rachel's calm acceptance felt like a reminder of just how lonely my pain was. I glanced back at the car, my bags hastily packed, and suddenly I just wanted to get out of there, to escape the suffocating weight of betrayal and disappointment. "I'm sorry to have bothered you, Rachel," I mumbled, feeling my voice waver. I thought you should know." "Thank you, Jack," she said softly, nodding. "Take care of yourself." With nothing left to say, I turned and walked back to my car, each step feeling heavier. The forest around me seemed darker now, colder, as if it, too, was swallowing me whole. I got in the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, feeling the silence settle over me like a thick fog. As I started the engine, a million thoughts raced through my mind, each one darker than the last. I hadn't just lost Sophie, I'd lost the person I thought she was. And in that hollow realization, I felt a deep, piercing loneliness that nothing seemed capable of filling. The drive home felt longer than usual, the dark road stretching endlessly before me. I barely noticed the passing landscape, my mind still caught up in the events of the night, replaying everything over and over. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, each bump in the road only reminding me of the turmoil churning inside. My phone vibrated in the cup holder, her name flashing on the screen. I didn't even hesitate, I let it ring until it stopped. Moments later, a series of notifications chimed, one after another, texts from Sophie. Each ding from my phone echoed in the silence, but I didn't care. I ignored every message, every call, every desperate attempt she made to reach me. She didn't deserve a response, not after what I'd seen. Let her stay out there in the cold, in the darkness, with him. Maybe they'd find some comfort together, but she wasn't coming back here, not to me, not ever. If she wanted Mike, then he could take care of her now. The house was empty and dark when I finally pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. I sat in the silence for a moment, just staring at the house we'd built together, where we'd shared so many moments, both good and bad. It felt like looking at a stranger's home. The memories felt tainted, every room a reminder of the life I thought we were building, the life she had betrayed so easily. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a finality that felt almost satisfying. The air inside was stale, heavy with the weight of all the things left unsaid. It felt colder than it should have, as if even the warmth had abandoned this place. Without hesitating, I went straight to our bedroom. Her scent lingered faintly, mixed with the soft notes of her perfume that still clung to her clothes. It hit me, cutting deeper than I'd expected, a cruel reminder of the nights we'd shared here, of the trust one thought we had. I didn't waste any time. Pulling open the closet, I grabbed her clothes, every single item, and threw them onto the bed in a heap. Dresses, sweaters, jackets, the small things I used to compliment her on, things that felt like part of her, all of it felt foreign now, as if I were looking at pieces of a stranger. I threw them into her suitcase without care, shoving in whatever I could get my hands on. Each item I packed was like shedding another layer of the life we'd built, the life she'd thrown away. I barely felt anything anymore, just a hollow determination to erase her presence from this place. Her texts continued coming in, more insistent now, but I didn't read a single one. I caught glimpses of the words on my screen, "Jack, please, it's not what you think, I can explain," each one more desperate than the last. But I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. She'd had her chance, and she'd made her choice. Let her find comfort in her own lies now, just as she'd found it with Mike out in the woods. As I worked, I thought back to our life together, the moments that seemed so real at the time, our hikes, the long nights spent talking under the stars, the plans we'd made for the future. Each memory felt like a betrayal now, a lie she'd told me to keep me anchored to her while she drifted away. The anger simmered beneath the surface, fueled by the constant reminders of what I thought we had. I packed faster, wanting to be rid of every trace of her. The sooner I was done, the sooner I could close the door on this chapter of my life. When I finally finished, her suitcase sat by the door, a silent testament to the life we'd shared and the life she'd chosen to leave behind. I took one last look at the bedroom, now stripped of her belongings. It felt like a different place, empty yet somehow lighter. There was a sense of finality in the quiet that filled the room, a weight lifting as I realized I no longer owed her anything. Back downstairs, I tossed my phone onto the counter, not caring if it chimed again. I'd hear her out when I was ready, if I was ever ready. For now, her texts, her words, meant nothing. It was just noise, desperate attempts to undo what she'd done, to pretend that the truth wasn't as clear as it was. But I knew better. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt the sting of betrayal in a way that couldn't be undone with empty apologies or explanations. I slumped into the armchair, exhaustion settling over me, but sleep felt like a distant possibility. The silence of the house surrounded me, but it wasn't the comforting quiet I was used to. It was an emptiness, a void left behind by the betrayal, by the woman I had trusted, who had turned my life upside down. The ache in my chest pulsed with each beat, but I welcomed it, letting it remind me of why I was doing this, why I couldn't let her back into my life. As the hours passed, the anger faded to a numbness, a quiet resolve that settled over me. She'd lost her place in this home, in my life, and nothing she could say would change that. By the time dawn started creeping through the windows, I felt a strange sense of peace, a bitter but calming acceptance. She would come home, she would see her things packed by the door, and she would know that this was the end. I didn't need to wait for her. I didn't need to hear her excuses or explanations. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. As soon as my head hit the couch, the exhaustion swept over me like a tidal wave. The events of the night, the anger, and the hurt, all of it had drained me to the core. Sleep came quickly, pulling me into a deep, heavy slumber, free from the weight of reality. In the quiet darkness of my dream, I found myself back in the forest, surrounded by towering trees and the smell of pine. The air was cool and fresh, and there was Sophie, standing by the fallen tree where I'd last seen her with Mike. But this time, it was different. This time, I was the one there with her. She looked at me with those warm eyes I remembered, filled with affection and a glimmer of the spark we used to share. She reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm, and that familiar rush of excitement and connection washed over me. It was like we were transported back to the early days of our relationship, where every touch, every glance, was filled with promise and passion. We leaned into each other, our lips meeting softly at first, then deepening as the moments passed. It felt so real, so intense. I could feel her warmth, her breath mingling with mine, as if everything that had happened was just a bad memory I could finally leave behind. Her hand trailed down, fingers brushing against me, and an electric thrill surged through me, igniting something I hadn't felt in a long time. The lines between dream and reality blurred, and I lost myself in that moment, in her touch, her warmth. Then, I jolted awake, the lingering excitement from the dream still pulsing through me. But as my eyes adjusted to the room, reality crashed over me in a tidal wave of shock and disbelief. Sophie was there, actually there, sitting beside me on the couch, her hand trailing down just like in the dream, her touch now all too real. My mind struggled to catch up with the situation, the surreal feeling quickly replaced by a rush of confusion, anger, and an unsteady mix of emotions. "Sophie?" I managed to croak, my voice thick with the remnants of sleep and disbelief. My instinctive reaction was to pull back, but part of me was too shocked to move, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the situation. Here she was, touching me, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. She didn't answer right away, just looked at me with a faint smile that held a mix of apology and something else, something that felt wrong after everything I'd been through tonight. I wanted to explain, she whispered, her voice soft, almost pleading. I made a mistake, Jack. A terrible mistake. The anger that had faded with exhaustion flared back to life, surging through me with renewed intensity. I sat up, shrugging off her hand, my mind reeling. I hadn't even had the chance to process how she got into the house, how she'd ended up here, sitting beside me after everything she'd done. Explain? I hissed, barely keeping my voice steady. After what I saw? After you betrayed me with Mike? She flinched, pulling her hand back as her expression softened, the regret evident in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Jack, she murmured. I wasn't thinking. It was a mistake, a horrible, stupid mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. Her words washed over me, but they did little to quell the anger boiling inside. Didn't mean for it to happen? I repeated, bitterness lacing my voice. I saw you, Sophie. I saw everything. It wasn't some fleeting moment. You wanted to be with him. You chose him. She dropped her gaze, her shoulders slumping as if she were carrying the weight of her own shame. I know. I know what I did, and I can't change it. But, Jack, her voice wavered, filled with a desperation that tugged at the edge of my anger. I'm here now because I want to fix this. I don't want to lose you. I didn't realize what I had until tonight. I felt a pang of conflicted emotions at her words, a part of me aching at the thought of everything we'd built together, the memories we'd shared. But the betrayal was still fresh, raw, a wound that her presence only made worse. You should have thought about that before, I said, the hurt in my voice coming out sharper than I intended. I trusted you, Sophie. I gave everything to this relationship. And you threw it all away. Her eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she reached for me again, her voice breaking. Please, Jack, just give me a chance to make this right. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you. We've been through so much together. Don't let this be the end. I looked at her, taking in her pleading expression, the way her shoulders slumped in regret, and felt the weight of her words pressing against the walls I'd built around myself. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way back from this. But the hurt was still too raw, too deep. I took a deep breath, my gaze unwavering. Sophie, I don't know if there's anything left to save, I said quietly. The words hurt to say, but they felt honest, the truth of how deeply she'd wounded me. You've shattered something between us, something I'm not sure can be fixed. Her face crumpled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand, Jack. I'm so sorry. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her words, her apology, hanging heavily in the air. I could feel the exhaustion settling over me again, but this time, it was an exhaustion of the soul, a weariness that went deeper than sleep could ever cure. The bond we'd shared felt fractured, a fragile thread that had once been unbreakable, now barely holding on. Without another word, I stood up, moving to the doorway, putting distance between us. Sophie remained on the couch, watching me, her eyes filled with sorrow and regret. For a moment, I wanted to say something, to soften the blow, to tell her I still loved her despite everything. But the hurt was too deep, the betrayal too fresh. Right now, all I needed was space, time to let the pieces of my life settle around me. And with that, I left her there, the echoes of our past lingering in the air, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. I stepped outside, sitting heavily on the cold, hard steps as the weight of my thoughts pressed down on me. The night air was still, and I found myself staring out into the quiet darkness, searching for some clarity amidst the chaos. My mind raced with conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, and that lingering ache of desire that hadn't yet faded. Was this my last chance to forgive her, to let the past fade away and reclaim what we'd once had? Or was I only being driven by raw excitement, my mind clouded by the unexpected intimacy we'd shared, despite everything? I sat there, wrestling with the questions, unable to find answers. The memories of her betrayal, so vivid and raw, clashed with the feeling of her touch, the way she'd looked at me on the couch, pleading, vulnerable. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still feel the warmth of her hand, the way she'd reached out, bridging a gap that felt impossible to cross. Was it even possible to move past everything that had happened tonight? Or was I only fooling myself, falling back into a familiar warmth out of habit, out of longing? The silence was heavy, and after a moment, I pushed the thoughts away. Maybe this wasn't a time for decisions or analysis. Maybe all I needed to do was follow my instincts, to see where this would lead, to face the aftermath when it came. I stood up, my resolve hardening with each step as I went back inside. When I re-entered the living room, Sophie was still sitting there, her eyes wide, filled with uncertainty. She looked up as I approached, a hint of hope flickering in her expression, as if she sensed the shift in my demeanor. I didn't say a word, didn't give her time to overthink or apologize. I took her hand, guiding her gently but firmly to her feet, and led her down the hallway, back to our bedroom, a space that once felt like ours, a place that held 1,000 memories of us. Once we were there, I looked at her, the hurt and anger briefly flickering in my eyes, but softened by the undeniable pull I still felt. "Continue what you were doing on the couch," I told her, my voice low, a mixture of command and invitation. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but there was a weight behind them, a challenge, as if I were testing her, as if I needed her to meet me halfway in this attempt to bridge what was broken. Sophie's gaze softened, and she moved closer, her hands finding their way to my shoulders, resting there with a tentative intimacy. She didn't hesitate, her touch was softer now, gentler, as if she understood the unspoken tension in the air, the emotions lingering between us. She pressed close, and I could feel the weight of her apology, her regret, in the way she touched me, in the care she took, as if trying to convey the words she couldn't quite say. For a moment, everything outside that room disappeared, the forest, Mike, even the betrayal. It was just the two of us, wrapped in a fragile intimacy that held the promise of something real, something worth fighting for, if only we could find a way to forgive. There was an urgency in her movements, a desperation, and I could feel it mirrored in my own heart, the part of me that still clung to the hope that maybe we could move past this. In those quiet moments, as her hands brushed over my skin and we surrendered to the wordless connection between us, the anger faded, replaced by something else, something more profound, a raw need to reclaim what we'd lost, to find a way back to each other. I held her close, allowing myself to feel the vulnerability in her touch, the silent plea she offered, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was our last chance to heal, to start over. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the knowledge of her betrayal entirely. Even in the depths of our closeness, a part of me held back, a small piece of my heart guarded, wary of giving in completely. They finally stopped near a fallen tree, where they sat close together, their heads tilted toward each other, speaking in hushed tones that I couldn't make out. The quietness of their conversation, the intimacy of the moment, made my stomach turn. I should have left, should have walked away before whatever happened next, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear myself away. Then, slowly, they leaned in closer. Mike's hand rose to Sophie's cheek, and he brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering longer than they should have. A second later, their lips met, a soft, lingering kiss that deepened as they both leaned into each other. I felt my throat tighten, bile rising as I tried to process the betrayal unfolding right in front of me. But then, I heard it, Sophie's soft moans, breaking the silence of the forest. Each sound pierced through me, twisting the knife of betrayal deeper. I wanted to move, to shout, to do anything, but I couldn't. I was trapped, paralyzed by disbelief and pain, forced to witness the shattering of whatever was left of our relationship. My mind screamed at me to look away, but my body refused, gripped by the horrid fascination of a man watching his world fall apart. In that moment, the fire I had hoped to rekindle was snuffed out completely, replaced by a cold emptiness. My mind was reeling, a chaotic mix of shock, anger, and betrayal that pulsed with every beat of my heart. I knew I couldn't stay another moment, not here, not after what I'd just seen. Without looking back, I made my way swiftly back to our tent, each step feeling heavier as the reality of what had happened sank in. The laughter of my friends around the dimming campfire seemed distant and hollow, as if I were miles away from it all, encased in my own bubble of anguish and rage. I stumbled into the tent, barely able to see straight as I yanked at the zipper on my bag and started shoving my clothes inside. The tea-eyed maid for Sophie sat there, now cold, mocking me with the thought of the effort I'd put into trying to make this trip special. I packed it all up, stuffing the pillows, sleeping bags, anything that bore the memory of what we were supposed to share. I no longer cared about being quiet or discreet. I wanted them to hear me, to know that I was leaving, that I wasn't sticking around to be humiliated. As I dismantled the tent, my hands shook, fumbling with the poles and stakes in my haste. My mind kept flashing back to them on that fallen tree, to the way Sophie had melted into his arms, her soft moans echoing in my head, each one a painful reminder of her betrayal. Rage boiled within me, a bitter determination to reclaim my dignity. If they wanted each other, they could have each other, here, alone in the woods. Let them wake up to the empty space I left behind, let them deal with the fallout of their actions. Packing up didn't take long. I didn't care about organizing or packing things neatly. I just threw everything into my bag, collapsing the tent haphazardly and stuffing it in. I was a storm tearing through the campsite, driven by fury and a thirst for some kind of revenge, some form of payback for the hurt Sophie had inflicted on me.